A peaceful start in the suburbs. In the picturesque suburbs of Savannah, Georgia, a place where houses stood lined like toy blocks painted in pastel hues and white picket fences marked the boundaries of quiet lives, the Parker family fit right in with the image of suburban perfection. John Parker, a decorated former sergeant in the Army, had traded combat boots for loafers when he retired to a serene life as a logistics manager for a local shipping company. His neighbors often spoke of him as a man of discipline, sharp wit, and a certain southern charm that earned him respect across the community. His wife, Lisa Parker, was the heart of the family. Lisa, a kindergarten teacher, was known for her warm smile and passion for helping kids explore their creativity. Every summer her floral dresses and wide-brimmed hats became a familiar sight in her lush backyard garden, her hands muddy from planting marigolds and petunias that painted their yard with vibrant colors. Together, John and Lisa were the kind of couple that neighbors loved to talk about at weekend BBQs, not for any scandalous drama, but out of admiration for their seemingly perfect life. Life in the Parkers' cozy, two-story colonial was, by all outward appearances, idyllic. Their morning routines were as much a part of the neighborhood rhythm as the chirping of birds on sweeping oak trees or the clink of coffee mugs at the local diner. John would load the dishwasher, affixing a post-it reminder for Lisa with neat block letters. "Pick up dry cleaning, thanks hun, 3. Meanwhile, their 7-year-old son David would rush out the door leaving a trail of Fruit Loops across the kitchen floor on his way to catch the bus. His younger sister Emily, a 4-year-old bundle of curly brown hair and giggles, would sit in front of the television with Sesame Street blaring and a plush Elmo tucked under her arm. Weekends were spent as a family. John worked on home improvement projects, bracing ladders and wielding power tools expertly, while Lisa teased him for taking double the time most handymen would. They'd sit on the patio sipping Pinot Grigio in the evenings, while David and Emily played catch under the dusky pink sky. Laughter filled every corner of the home and spilled out into the neighborhood streets, a sound much loved by everyone around. No one in their cul-de-sac questioned the small Parker family's happiness. Their life seemed like the fulfillment of the suburban American dream, a loving marriage, 2 adorable kids, a house with a front yard swing, and the kind of easy camaraderie that drew others toward them. Neighborhood potlucks were hosted in their backyard where John manned the grill, like a proud commander while Lisa passed out her famous peach cobbler. "Man," the neighbor down the street once said to his wife watching John toss a football with David while Lisa clapped enthusiastically from the porch, "I wish we had the Parkers' life, they just make it look so damn wholesome." "The perfect family," his wife agreed, adjusting her sun hat with a wistful smile. At 3 a.m. the sound of heavy thudding echoed from the downstairs hallway. The heat in Lisa's chest bloomed into panic as she sat bolt upright in bed. Her first instinct was her children. Quietly but swiftly, she checked the hall, heart hammering against her ribs. Emily's door, slightly ajar, revealed her softly snoring toddler. David, in the next room, was silent but safe. Lisa stood frozen in the dim lighting of the hallway for a moment, trying to steady herself enough to brush off her unease. With a now calmer breath she decided the sound could easily have been the heavy oak door blown ajar from the autumn winds. Up and down the steps she walked, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her frame. She glanced at the front door, it was locked. She flicked on the porch light, nothing, not a leaf out of place, and the swing on the porch sat still and unmoving under the pale yellow bulb. Hovering in her home somewhere was John Parker, though she wouldn't know it until it was too late. He had entered not through doors but a small opened crawl partition by the garage she hadn't thought to check in over a few years. What was the motive for an off-said trip startling big shine gestures? His husband-in-show shouts, "Oh, let me continue properly and detail it further." The night of tragedy. As Lisa returned upstairs, soundless as to not wake the children, she still couldn't shake the faint prickle of unease crawling up her spine. She told herself for the 100th time that night that there was nothing to fear. Savannah was safe, wasn't it? Their street was the very definition of quiet Americana. Block parties in the summer, the occasional garage band noise from a teenager, but nothing sinister, nothing dangerous. But even as she slipped back into bed and pulled the duvet over her, Lisa didn't realize the real danger lurked not outside her home, but within her walls. Downstairs, in the shadowed stillness of their kitchen, John Parker stood. His entire body was tense, his breath shallow. He had driven through the night, arriving back in Savannah hours before, under the radar of anyone who might notice. Not his coworkers, not his neighbors, not his family. Dressed in all black and methodical in his silence, he hadn't turned on a single light. His movements had been rehearsed over and over in his mind, tick for tick, step for step, until every faint squeak of the house's wooden floorboards was logged into the details of his memory. He wasn't supposed to be there. In John's narrative, he was out of state on a work trip, halfway across the country in California, attending an important logistics managers conference. That's what the itinerary said. That's what Lisa believed. The children, tucked warm in their beds, believed the same thing. Careful not to jostle the creaky kitchen drawers, John reached into his duffel bag. Inside was a pair of industrial gloves, the blueprints for his plan meticulously mapped out, and a set of electrical wires clipped neatly into coils. His hands shook for a split second, but his iron will steadied him quickly. This wasn't just about an affair gone messy. It was about freedom. Freedom from the suffocating life he no longer wanted. Freedom from Lisa's knowing, loving gaze that he now found unbearable. Lisa's soft footsteps from above paused him. His hand froze in mid-reach. The overhead creak traveled across the bedroom floor and stopped. She was standing still now, doing something. Listening, writing in that little floral journal of hers. He could picture it. She always wrote at night. Maybe about the kids or what David had accomplished in class. Perhaps a dream about their upcoming family vacation. Think, he whispered under his breath, a command to himself. Stick to the plan. Lisa, oblivious to the dangerous thoughts forming in her husband's mind, shifted in her bed, rolled on her side, and finally fell into a light, peaceful sleep. It was just a few short hours later, at roughly 4:30 a.m., when the police received a 911 call from a teary, trembling David Parker. His voice was weak, cracked with confusion and shock. "I think something's wrong with Mom. She won't wake up and her skin feels cold. Please come." By the time emergency responders arrived, Lisa was already gone. At first glance, her death seemed like a freak accident, lying there in a heap next to an exposed electrical outlet in her bedroom. Although David believed she had been fixing something before it went horribly wrong, first responders and detectives began putting the pieces together almost immediately. The untouched dust around the outlet, the oddly meticulous placement of items nearby, as if they had been staged, and most importantly, the clear lack of any bruising, struggle, or signs that Lisa had actually been working on an exposed outlet that night. The first lead. Savannah's mornings usually wake to the harmonious sounds of chirping birds and neighbors exchanging cheerful greetings as they pick up their newspapers or walk their dogs. But that morning, the Parker house was an epicenter of tension, buzzing with the chatter of police radios, the flash of cameras, and the hushed whispers of curious neighbors who gathered on the sidewalk in their bathrobes. Inside the house, subdued and dim despite the early sunlight, the Parker children sat on the living room couch under the watchful eye of a friendly officer. 7-year-old David Parker was a mess of confusion and tears. His little sister Emily, clutching her Elmo doll tightly, sat silently, barely understanding what had happened. Detective Abigail Carter, a seasoned Savannah detective with a no-nonsense attitude and a piercing gaze, knelt before David. She offered him a gentle smile, her soft-spoken approach a contrast to the bustling investigators rummaging through the Parker home. "David," she began, her voice calm but steady, "I know you're scared, and this is a lot, but you're such a brave boy for calling 911. You helped your mom a lot today." David nodded, wiping his nose with his pajama sleeve. "But she didn't wake up," he whimpered, his big blue eyes filling with another well of tears. Detective Carter nodded solemnly. "I know, sweetheart, but we're here to figure out what happened, so I need your help. Can you tell me about last night? Did anything unusual happen?" David squirmed in his seat, clutching a piece of blanket from the couch. "It was just regular. I brushed my teeth and Mommy made me read a book 'cause she said I stayed up too late the other night." His words spilled out quickly the way children talk when trying to explain something big. But then, David paused, his tiny brows knitting together in confused thought. I heard Daddy." Detective Carter froze for a fraction of a second, but her expression remained gentle and neutral. "You heard your dad?" David nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, I heard him, late at night." This revelation hit Detective Carter like a jigsaw puzzle piece snapping into place. "Late at night, huh? Was he home, David?" she asked, trying to mask her intrigue behind casual curiosity. David hesitated. "I don't think so. Mommy said Daddy was in California for work, but..." He leaned in closer to whisper, as if telling an important secret. "I woke up because I heard the door. It sounded like when Daddy comes home late sometimes." Carter's heart skipped a beat. She kept her tone calm, soft. "What time was that, do you think? Do you remember anything else?" David's face scrunched in concentration. I don't know the time, just really late. Like, dark outside. I got out of bed and I looked from the stairs, he said, pointing in the direction of the upstairs landing. And I saw someone down there. I think it was Daddy. It was Daddy? Carter pressed gently. Did you see his face? David shook his head. No, it was dark, but I heard his voice. I know Daddy's voice. Emily, who had remained quiet thus far, suddenly chimed in, her young voice high-pitched but filled with conviction. Daddy was wearing his black coat, the one Mommy likes. I saw him too. Detective Carter's eyebrows raised slightly. She was careful not to overreact or prompt the children too much. You saw him, Emily? She asked gently. When was that, sweetheart? Emily nodded her little head, gripping Elmo tighter. He was by the door. He looked at me, but then he went away. Mommy was asleep. David, annoyed by his younger sister's interruption, frowned. You didn't see him, Emily. You were sleeping with Elmo, he defended, clearly wanting the attention back on him. I did too see him, Emily protested, her curls bouncing as she shook her head adamantly. Daddy was, I saw him! Detective Carter rose to her feet, her mind turning these statements over. The Parker children, while young, were aligning on something that threw a wrench into the timeline everyone had assumed. Their father, John Parker, wasn't supposed to be home. He was in California, at least according to the logistics manager's conference itinerary he had provided. She excused herself politely and moved to the kitchen where her partner, Detective Raymond Dorsey, was combing through the duffel bag the forensic team retrieved earlier that morning. He glanced up when he saw her approach. So? He asked, tossing aside a pair of gloves from the bag. John Parker, Carter said slowly, her voice carrying the weight of her thoughts, might have been here last night. Dorsey frowned, clearly skeptical. Thought he was supposed to be across the country? Kids say otherwise, Carter replied, glancing back toward the living room where David was helping Emily adjust Elmo's arm. She turned back to her partner. David says he heard his dad late at night and saw someone downstairs. Emily claims the same. Dorsey scratched his jawline while processing this. Could just be a kid's imagination, you know, they just lost their mom. Maybe they're reaching for something familiar to make it make sense. Maybe, Carter acknowledged. But her investigative instinct told her there was more to this. But what if they aren't? What if John here last night? Dorsey sighed, shaking his head. Then he's got some explaining to do when we track him down. He paused, holding up a set of coiled electrical wires he'd just pulled from the bag, as if to emphasize the gravity of the situation. These kids might have just given us the first crack in the whole damn story. The dark motive unfolds. The Parker family was the epitome of suburban bliss in the eyes of its neighbors. They were the family everyone aspired to be, beautiful home, polite kids, and outwardly, a picture-perfect marriage. But behind the closed doors of that pristine colonial-style house, the reality was a far cry from the fantasy, and hidden deep within John Parker was a dark, festering secret that would soon come to light. Detective Abigail Carter leaned back in her chair at the precinct, absently rubbing her temple as she stared at the printed emails spread out on her desk. She had been combing through them for hours. The intricate web of messages between John Parker and a woman named Clara Jones hinted at something far more sinister than a mere extramarital affair. So, who's Clara? Her partner, Detective Raymond Dorsey, asked as he walked into the room holding 2 steaming cups of black coffee. He set one down in front of her and plopped into the chair opposite. And why do we care about her? Clara Jones, Carter began, her voice laced with intrigue. 31, works as a freelance designer and, according to these, has been carrying on a not-so-discreet affair with our boy John Parker for the last 2 years. She slid one of the emails across to Dorsey, who scanned the words with a low whistle. Counting down the days until we can finally be together, Dorsey read aloud, shaking his head. Damn, cold-blooded. And this started while he was still living with Lisa? It gets worse, Carter added, pulling out another email thread flagged by the tech team. 2 months ago, Clara's medical insurance billed her for a procedure, a D&C at a private clinic downtown. She paused for effect. Same clinic where another set of emails confirms John had scheduled time-sensitive appointments. Dorsey straightened up in his chair, coffee forgotten. Wait, are you saying... She was pregnant, Carter confirmed, her tone matter-of-fact but heavy with the weight of the revelation. And not anymore. Looks like John paid for the abortion. Emailed the damn clinic to make sure all the costs were covered discreetly. Jesus, Dorsey muttered, dragging a hand through his thinning hair. Alright, so the guy's a cheating dirtbag. But jumping from an affair and covering up a pregnancy to murdering your wife? That's one hell of a leap. Carter nodded, pulling out another piece of the puzzle. Handwritten notes recovered from John's desk drawer. That's what I thought too, until I saw this. Dorsey leaned forward, scanning the lined paper with grim lines on his face. The words were written in John's neat, military-style hand. "Freedom starts with sacrifice, no more lies." "This guy's a piece of work," Dorsey said after a moment. "Freedom? Sacrifice, what does that even mean?" "It means he saw his family as a burden," Carter said flatly. Her voice had a sharp edge now, one fueled by anger. "Think about it, Ray. To everyone else, John Parker was the all-American dad, a war hero turned family man. But under the surface, he was suffocating. You know the type. Married straight out of the army, had kids before he had time to figure out what he wanted. And somewhere along the line, he decided what he didn't want was Lisa and their life together." Dorsey leaned back, silent for a moment, digesting the new pieces clicking into place. "And Clara, she was his out." "Exactly," Carter said. "A younger woman, no strings attached. Someone who didn't expect him to play house or host PTA meetings. Someone who didn't know John Parker, the husband and father, the version of him he clearly wanted to leave behind." "It's all so calculated," Dorsey muttered, shaking his head. "But why kill Lisa? Why not just, I don't know, file for divorce?" Carter gave him a sharp look. "Guys like John Parker, divorce wasn't an option, too messy, too public. He'd lose his job, his reputation, and let's not forget the money. In all their finances, it's clear Lisa had the upper hand. Half this house, her name's on the deed. His military pension, part of that would have gone to alimony and child support. And the kids, he wasn't winning full custody. Not with someone like Lisa raising them. Divorce didn't free him from the life he hated, it chained him to it." "And murder?" Dorsey asked, his voice bitter. "That makes sense to him? To someone like him, murder doesn't just make sense, it's clean. He rids himself of Lisa, keeps the house, keeps his money, and, if he pulls it off, he keeps his reputation. The poor widowed father card? That plays a lot better than deadbeat divorcee." Dorsey let out a low whistle, shaking his head again. "We might have just solved the motive." "Oh, it gets better," Carter said, pulling out another piece of evidence. This time it was a snapshot of a handwritten to-do list. "Guess what we found on his desk this morning?" She read the items aloud. "Check wires, confirm timing, finalize false itinerary." "Timing, wires?" Dorsey repeated, narrowing his eyes. "This guy planned every step." "Exactly," Carter said, slapping the page down. "Lisa's death wasn't an accident. It wasn't spur-of-the-moment rage either. This was premeditated. He faked a whole damn trip to California, wired his paycheck to prove he was out of state, and then snuck back here to stage the scene in Savannah. He rehearsed this, Ray. Everything from the electrical wires to the damn lies he fed his kids when they saw him." As the realization sank in, Dorsey looked far more somber. This guy didn't just kill his wife, he erased her. Turned her into the accident that gave him a free pass to start over. Carter nodded, her expression grim. "The problem with guys like John Parker, they think they're smarter than everyone else. But you don't plan a perfect murder when you've already left breadcrumbs for the detectives to follow." "What breadcrumbs?" Dorsey asked. Carter gave a wry smile. "Clara Jones, for one. All we have to do is talk to her." "And then?" Dorsey asked. "And then," Carter replied, leaning back with her coffee, "we unravel the rest of this nightmare, thread by thread. Crafting a flawless crime scene." The Parker home was still under the eerie quiet of Savannah's night when John put his plan into motion. He moved with the precision of a man who had been trained to operate under pressure. Every step, every decision had been rehearsed in his mind over countless sleepless nights, ensuring that no detail would be left to chance. It would look like an accident. That was John Parker's genius. If he pulled it off, no one would even think to question foul play. Lisa's death would appear tragic but believable. Flipping through every strategy he had learned during his time in the army, he crafted the details carefully. The execution would be cold, calculated, and above suspicion. Above all, it would leave him blameless. The next morning, still at the precinct, Detective Abigail Carter leaned against the edge of her desk, reviewing the evidence. "This guy didn't just wing it. Everything about the scene screams setup," she said, motioning toward the photos laid out in front of her. There was a visible frustration in her voice, tempered by the kind of determination that came from years on the job. Across the room, her partner, Detective Raymond Dorsey, was munching on a stale donut, his expression tired but curious. "So, walk me through it," he said, gesturing toward the photos. "What makes you think it wasn't just some freak accident?" Carter tapped a photo of the bedroom outlet where Lisa had been found. "This. Start with the fact that Lisa didn't do DIY projects. All of her friends said the same thing. She hated tools, hated fixing things. She wasn't the one patching wall sockets at 2 in the morning, and look at the dust pattern around the outlet." She leaned in closer to the photo. See that? A clean streak, like it had been wiped down, but the surrounding area, undisturbed. Dorsey frowned, squinting at the photo. Okay, so someone tampered with it, wiped it clean, probably him, but... He let his voice trail off as he thought. What exactly makes that Lisa's death and not just him helping with household stuff? Wiped clean doesn't scream murder to me. You're not wrong, Carter admitted, but she grabbed another photo and laid it beside the first. It showed the duffel bag they had recovered from John's car. But then there's this. Electrical wires, gloves and these, she said, pointing at what looked like paper sketches in the corner of the frame. Blueprints for rewiring a socket, specifically designed to create short circuits under pressure. Dorsey raised his eyebrows at that. You're telling me the guy intentionally rigged the outlet? Exactly. Carter set the coffee cup she'd been holding down with a thud. He played on the idea that no one would look twice at a wife accidentally electrocuting herself in her bedroom. Hell, we nearly bought it at first. But it's the details, Ray. Lisa didn't touch the wires. There were no fingerprints on the equipment. The wiring itself was damn near professional, way above a housewife's skill set. She paused for a moment, her finger hovering over the photo. And then there's this. She pulled out a small evidence bag containing the note they had found in John's office. Scribbled across it in his neat handwriting were phrases like, she glanced up at her partner. Does that sound like a guy out of town on a work trip to you? Dorsey chuckled darkly. Nope. Sounds like our guy's been reading electrical engineering manuals late at night. He rubbed his jaw. Okay, so he rigs the outlet, sets the scene, kills his wife. What I don't get is how he thought he'd pull it off, long term. You'd think he'd leave some cracks for us to find. And that, Carter replied, with a spark of grim satisfaction in her voice, is exactly why perpetrators get caught. It's not about leaving no cracks, it's about thinking the cracks. She shifted another photograph forward, this one of the post-mortem analysis. Because here's something he didn't consider, the angle of the burn on Lisa's hand. It doesn't line up with her doing the work, it's evidence of how he against the socket long enough for the electrocution to complete. Dorsey's face darkened as the pieces began to click together. You're saying he staged her death not just with tools but by physically making sure she died that way? Exactly. Carter folded her arms, staring down at the photos with an expression equal parts rage and pride. Rage at what John had done, pride at how they were piecing it all together. He didn't rely on chance, he planned every step of this. All right, so we know, but I'm guessing he had to cover his tracks after the fact. Dorsey gestured to the still unreviewed reports stacked on Carter's desk. What's the alibi? He couldn't just claim to be out of town and hope we wouldn't look deeper. Carter snorted. Oh, he made sure of that. His itinerary was airtight at first glance. Airfare tickets, hotel bookings in California. He even filmed himself at the conference and sent video calls to the kids. But here's the crack he didn't think mattered. He reused footage. Dorsey froze with a grin that hadn't quite reached his lips. No way. Please tell me this idiot didn't. Oh, he did, Carter quipped, permitting herself the tiniest smirk. Our tech guys scraped his computer. Every message, every video. Turns out he had created the illusion of being on a conference trip by recording his hotel room message weeks earlier. And get this. He uploaded his airline ticket to a flight he never boarded. Cross-checked. Never showed. Shaking his head, Dorsey leaned back. Geez. I'll give him credit, though. This isn't a backyard barbecue alibi. Sounds like hours of planning. That's just it, Ray, Carter said, her voice low. This guy wasn't stupid. He wanted us to see this as a tragic accident. A poor husband lost his wife story. But the problem with staging a crime scene is, no matter how perfect you think it is, there's always one thing you can't account for. Dorsey raised an eyebrow. Which is? Carter gazed at the evidence spread before them, her eyes sharp with determination. The truth! It's always there, waiting for someone to find it. The investigation surrounds him. The bustling energy of the Savannah Police Department's precinct was in sharp contrast to the stillness of the Parker home just days prior. What had started as a tragic accident was now unraveling into a potential premeditated crime, and as the evidence against John Parker slowly came to light, the investigation escalated, pulling every available officer and resource onto the case. Detective Abigail Carter had officially made John Parker the prime suspect, though the department had yet to make a public move. She was the kind of detective who didn't rush to conclusions, but there was something about this case, something about John's behavior since his wife's death, that didn't sit right with her. And now, as she stared at the timeline spread across the whiteboard in her office, she saw the pieces starting to fall into place. So, we've got John leaving Savannah, or At least that's what his work itinerary says, Carter muttered to herself as she aligned schedules and tracked flights. But the deeper we dig, the murkier his story becomes. She jabbed a finger at a gap in the timeline. This is where he slips. Behind her, Detective Raymond Dorsey entered the room, balancing a stack of files and a coffee that looked far too weak for the morning they were about to tackle. "Guess who didn't scan into the TSA gates at Savannah International?" he said, grinning like he'd just cracked the case wide open. Carter turned, raising an eyebrow. "John Parker?" "Bingo," Dorsey said, setting the files down on her desk with a satisfying smack. "We cross-checked. He booked a ticket, emailed the itinerary to his boss, even had a seat assignment. But what he didn't do was actually board the flight." Carter leaned forward, her interest piqued. "So, what do we have? He drives back into town instead of flying? How the hell does someone think they can fake a trip in the age of digital tracking?" "By being a cocky son of a bitch who overestimates his own importance," Dorsey shot back. "Guy probably thought no one would double-check, especially not his co-workers. Think about it. He's a former Army sergeant, all buttoned up and disciplined. No one questions a guy like that when he says he's going to a conference." Carter was already working that angle in her mind. He waited until the house was dark, pulled into the driveway just far enough to be hidden from nosy neighbors, and snuck in through that damn crawl space by the garage. She fell silent for a minute, her sharp mind turning over how methodical this was. What else do we know about his supposed trip? "Well," Dorsey began, flipping through one of the files, "he used his corporate card for a hotel booking near LAX. That checks out, except the timestamp on the reservation. It's all online. He never physically checked into the room. Even better, we called the hotel." He gave her a knowing look. "Nobody saw him." Carter leaned back in her chair, smiling faintly. It was the grim smile of a detective starting to pull the rug out from under a suspect. So he created a phantom version of himself. Emails, itineraries, even some video calls to the kids. All of it pre-recorded so no alarm bells would go off. "Speaking of the kids," Dorsey added, rubbing his jaw, "that little tidbit from David and Emily about seeing their dad the night of Lisa's death? Creeping me out the more I think about it. I mean, kids don't lie about voices they'd recognize practically from birth. And Emily? That girl is adamant she saw him in his black coat." Carter nodded slowly. "They gave us our first real crack in the story, and if John's alibi is falling apart at the seams, that brings us to motive." "Ah, the million-dollar question," Dorsey said, settling into the chair across from her. "Why kill Lisa now? What was the rush?" Carter pulled out fresh copies of John's financial records. "It's right here. Look at the joint accounts. Lisa was smart. She controlled the strings. Her name's on the title of the house, her credit score is sky high, and his, not so much. If John wanted to start a new life with Clara, Lisa was the obstacle. He couldn't just divorce her, not without losing half of everything, and not without drawing attention to the affair." Dorsey frowned, glancing through the records. "So he figured murder would be cheaper. Cheaper, cleaner, and the court of public opinion would favor the grieving widower." Carter's tone sharpened, her anger just barely contained. "But he's a fool if he thought we wouldn't dig." Dorsey cracked open another file, this one freshly delivered from the forensics team. "And dig we did. You're gonna love this, Abby. This man's arrogance knows no bounds." He smiled as he slid the report across the table. "Guess what we found on his work-issued laptop?" Carter grabbed the report, scanning it quickly. Then her eyes widened. "Are you kidding me? He searched how to stage an accidental death?" "Not just that," Dorsey continued, clearly enjoying this moment. "He also searched wife not cooperating with divorce, electrocution fatalities, and, you're gonna love this one, how long do detectives follow up on accidents?" Carter groaned and pinched the bridge of her nose. "Jesus! Ray, we've got an actual amateur on our hands masquerading as a criminal mastermind." "Yeah, well, he nearly had us fooled," Dorsey said, leaning forward. "But it doesn't stop there. The cops who canvassed his neighborhood yesterday, they found a convenience store clerk who remembered seeing him the night of Lisa's death, buying duct tape and electrical gloves at 2 in the morning. A damn receipt ties him to Savannah when he was supposed to be sitting in a hotel room in California." "God bless receipts," Carter muttered. She stood, pacing the room now, her mind racing to connect the final dots. "So let's summarize," she began, gesturing toward the board. "He fakes a work trip, sneaks back to Savannah, rigs the bedroom outlet, and stages Lisa's death. He leaves just enough evidence to create an illusion of innocence, emails, itineraries, video calls, but he underestimates how carefully we'd look for those cracks. Now the timeline is shot, the alibi's crumbling, and the motive screams loud and clear." Dorsey grinned. What's the next move? We bring him in, Carter said firmly. John Parker's days of hiding behind his spotless reputation are over. It's time he answered for what he did. The unexpected search. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Parker driveway as detectives Abigail Carter and Raymond Dorsey arrived, armed with a warrant and a determination to turn the picture-perfect suburban home into the centerpiece of their investigation. As they stepped out of their unmarked SUV, the cul-de-sac was eerily quiet except for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Neighbors peered out their windows, curtains briefly twitching before falling back into place. The polite smile and barbecue-perfect charm of John Parker had kept these same neighbors comfortable and unsuspecting for years. Until now. Think we'll find more here than just big-screen TVs and carefully folded laundry? Dorsey muttered as they approached the front steps, his eyes scanning the house like it was a puzzle they were about to dismantle. Carter's response was quick, her voice sharp but steady. This house holds the answers we need, Ray. He's arrogant enough to think we wouldn't look, but I guarantee he's slipped up somewhere. As they reached the door, Carter knocked firmly. A second later, the door opened to reveal John Parker himself, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt. He looked calm, too calm. His steady hand on the doorknob and subtle smile betrayed no sign of unease, but Carter could see it, the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw for just a split second. "Detectives," John said, leaning slightly against the doorframe. His southern charm was in full swing, masking what Carter could only assume was growing dread beneath the surface. "What brings y'all here today? I assume this isn't just a social call." Dorsey, ever the straight-talker, held up the search warrant. "John Parker, this is a warrant to search the premises. We won't take up too much of your time." John's smile didn't falter. "A warrant, huh?" He took the paper as if scanning it but didn't read past the bolded header. "Right. Well, I don't want to get in your way. You go ahead, just mind the rug there in the entry. My wife loved keeping it spotless." The mention of Lisa's meticulous housekeeping was a calculated move, Carter noticed, an attempt to inject a sense of everyday normalcy into the tragedy, but as John stepped aside to let them in, his calm demeanor only made her more suspicious. Inside, the Parker home felt pristine, almost staged. The sharp scent of pine cleaner filled the air, and not a single item appeared out of place. Carter's eyes swept the room, cataloging it all. The lovingly framed family photos on the mantel, the impossibly clean tile floors, and the bookshelf lined with novels that looked more decorative than read. It was, in every sense, the perfect family home, the kind of place that screamed, "Look at how normal we are!" But Carter knew better. The devil was always in the details. "All right," Carter said firmly, snapping on a pair of gloves. "Let's start where it feels wrong." Dorsey, unwrapping the same pair of gloves from his pocket, gestured toward the kitchen. "He's ex-Army. Bet you he's got the garage locked tighter than a drum. Guys like him stash the good stuff in places they think are clever, but aren't nearly as subtle as they think." Carter nodded but took a step toward the far end of the living room, sensing something. "You take the garage," she ordered, her tone indicating she was already on a trail. "I want to see what's upstairs." The master bedroom was as spotless and magazine-ready as the rest of the house. The bed was perfectly made, the pillows arranged just so. Carter's eyes immediately locked onto the nightstand. There was Lisa's floral journal, left untouched since her death, a faint layer of dust gathering on its surface. Carter picked it up, thumbing through its pages. The entries were dotted with references to her children, her garden projects, and reminders to pick up groceries. But on the very last page, Carter noticed something startling, a partially torn note tucked inside the journal. The handwriting on the note wasn't Lisa's, it was John's, precise and military-like, and it read. Carter's mind buzzed. This wasn't just a to-do list, this was evidence. "Bingo," Carter murmured, carefully folding the note into an evidence bag. "I'll bet that's not the only secret John left lying around." As she descended the stairs, Dorsey appeared from the basement, his arms loaded with a duffel bag. "You're gonna want to see this," he said, his voice practically humming with discovery. The two detectives spread the bag's contents across the table in the dining room. Coiled electrical wires, industrial-grade gloves, and what appeared to be hand-drawn blueprints lay before them. Carter scanned the contents with sharp eyes, her instincts confirming what she already suspected. They had just uncovered John's toolkit for staging Lisa's death. "What do you think this says about our grieving husband, huh?" Dorsey asked, holding up one of the coiled wires with a grim smirk. "It says he planned every second of this," Carter replied, her voice cold. She pointed to the blueprints, where a crude sketch of a bedroom outlet was marked with notes like, But the real jackpot lay in a manila folder at the bottom of the duffel bag. Inside, Carter pulled out a handful of photos. They were of Clara Jones smiling and casually posing at what appeared to be various outdoor cafes. There were also several love notes, each of them an unapologetic declaration of John's feelings for her. Lisa's not even cold in the ground, and this guy's carrying around souvenirs of his girlfriend? Dorsey shook his head in disgust. He's not just guilty, he's sloppy. Carter's jaw tightened. This isn't just about arrogance, Ray. This is control. His little perfect life is falling apart, and we're about to tear the whole damn thing down. They hadn't even finished combing through the rest of the house when Carter's phone buzzed. It was one of the forensic technicians back at the station. "Detective Carter? Talk to me," she said briskly. "We examined Lisa's body again, specifically the electricity burns. You were right, there are faint contusions on her wrist consistent with someone physically holding her hand against the outlet. Whoever did this didn't just rig the scene, they were there, making sure it ended the way they wanted." Carter's blood ran cold, though outwardly she remained composed. "Thanks, keep me updated." As she hung up, Dorsey noticed her expression shift. "What is it?" Carter looked back toward the duffel bag and then toward the pristine room around them. "This wasn't just jealousy or a spur-of-the-moment fight," she said, her voice low and laced with anger. "John Parker had the nerve to make this personal, and now we're going to personally dismantle his entire story. Interrogation, and the breakdown." The buzzing fluorescent lights of the interrogation room seemed to amplify the intensity inside. The air was thick with tension, much like a courtroom just before a verdict, only this time the jury consisted of 2 detectives and 1 man slowly realizing the walls were closing in. John Parker sat at the metal table, his pristine button-down shirt and neatly combed hair in stark contrast to the bleak gray walls surrounding him. His posture was relaxed, or at least, he was putting on a good show of it. Detective Abigail Carter sat across from him with a calm, controlled demeanor that gave away nothing. Next to her was Detective Raymond Dorsey, leaning back in his chair with a faint smirk tugging at his lips, like he already knew how this was going to end. Between the two of them, a folder sat on the table, unopened but brimming with damning evidence. Its presence was deliberate, a subtle reminder to John that they had everything they needed to take him apart, piece by piece. Carter folded her hands and leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "Thanks for coming down, John," she said with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us." John met her gaze with a cool, collected expression. "Happy to help, Detective," he replied, his voice smooth, almost too controlled, as if rehearsed. "Whatever I can do to clear this mess up." Dorsey gave an exaggerated nod. "You're a real team player, John. We don't see husbands as cooperative as you every day, do we, Abby?" Carter shot her partner a quick warning glance before returning her attention to John. She slid the folder across the table and opened it slowly, laying its contents out like a dealer preparing a winning hand. Photos of the electrical blueprints, the coiled wires, Lisa's journal, and even snapshots of Clara Jones stared back at John, each item an unspoken accusation. Carter didn't speak right away. She let the weight of the evidence settle in the room like an unwelcome guest. For the first time John's composure faltered. It was subtle, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of unease in his otherwise steady eyes, but Carter caught it. She leaned back, giving him space to squirm. "Do you recognize these?" she asked calmly, her tone almost conversational as she gestured to the photos. John let out a soft chuckle, though it lacked any real humor. "Some of it, sure. That's Lisa's journal. And the wiring, well, I couldn't tell you much about that. I'm not exactly an electrician." Dorsey snorted. "Funny, because this wiring looks awful familiar to the setup we found in your workshop. You've got quite the toolkit, don't you, John?" John turned to Dorsey with a faint smile, but the tension in his shoulders was starting to show. "A man's got to keep his tools organized, Detective. That's all you've got? Tools in a garage?" Carter leaned forward again, her sharp gaze pinning him in place. "The thing is, John," she began, her voice soft but cutting, "this isn't just about tools. It's about planning. It's about how someone who's supposed to be halfway across the country leaves behind breadcrumbs so big, we don't even have to look hard to find them." John's smile disappeared, replaced by a carefully neutral expression. "I don't know what you're implying, Detective, but I think I deserve a little more respect than being accused of something I didn't do." "Oh, you think this is about respect?" Dorsey interjected, leaning forward with a grin that didn't hide his disdain. "You think we flew blind into this conversation, John?" Carter held up a printed photograph from the folder. It was a pixelated screenshot of John's search history. The top result was as damning as they came. How to stage an electrocution accident. She laid it down on the table, sliding it across to John until it was directly under his hands. "This look familiar?" she asked coldly. For the first time John's mask of calm cracked. His lips parted slightly as if he might speak, but no words came. The color drained from his face and a bead of sweat formed at his temple. He quickly wiped it away, disguising the movement as adjusting the cuff of his shirt. "That's not mine," he said after a beat, his voice low but firm. "You can't prove that I typed that." "We can, actually," Carter said smoothly, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "We have everything we need from your laptop, courtesy of your work-issued account. Every search, every email with Clara, all of it, John. This isn't a guessing game anymore." The mention of Clara visibly rattled him. His hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, balled into fists. "This has nothing to do with her," he said quickly, his voice rising slightly. "Leave her out of this." Dorsey smirked, sensing the crack in John's armor widening. "Oh, but it has everything to do with her, doesn't it? You pay for Clara's abortion, promise her the moon, and suddenly your wife becomes, what, an inconvenience? A problem to solve?" John shot him a glare, but Dorsey wasn't finished. He leaned forward, dropping his voice to a near whisper. "We know about the fake work trip. We know you never boarded that flight, and we know you came back to Savannah that night. And the kids, John, your own kids, saw you. They heard you. You don't think a 7-year-old knows his dad's voice?" "That's a lie," John snapped, the tension in his voice betraying his earlier calm demeanor. He looked from Dorsey to Carter, his composure unraveling with each passing second. "You're trying to twist this into something it's not. None of this proves That you what?" Carter interrupted sharply, her voice cutting through his protests. "None of it proves you what, John? That you were there? That you held Lisa's hand against that outlet and made damn sure she didn't survive?" John froze, the words hanging in the air like a ticking time bomb. For a long moment, he stared at the table, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Carter didn't let up. "Is that what freedom looks like to you, John?" she pressed, leaning closer. "Because I've read those notes in your office. No more lies, right? That's what you wrote. So tell me, John, how far does your version of freedom go?" Dorsey chimed in, his voice quieter this time but no less effective. "You can keep pretending this is all some kind of misunderstanding, or you can tell us the truth. Either way, John, this isn't going away." John's hands were trembling now, his jaw clenched tightly as his carefully constructed defenses crumbled under the weight of their questioning. He let out a shuddering breath before finally lifting his gaze to meet Carter's. His eyes, once so steely and composed, were now filled with a mixture of fear and defeat. "I didn't have a choice," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. Lisa would never let me go. She controlled everything. My life, my money, I couldn't breathe anymore." Carter nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "So you decided to take her life instead." John closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "She would have taken everything," he whispered. "And now?" Dorsey said, his tone cutting like a knife. "You've lost everything anyway." The crime and the consequences. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent, the kind of quiet that felt alive, breathing with the tension of every person inside it. The gallery was packed, every seat filled with reporters, friends, neighbors, and what remained of the Parker family. At the center of it all sat John Parker, his once confident demeanor now a shadow of its former self. His neatly combed hair, his crisp dress shirt, and the small flicker of charm he had tried to wield throughout the investigation were no longer enough to protect him from the reality of what he had done. Detective Abigail Carter watched from the back row, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had stared directly into the heart of John Parker's darkness during the interrogation, but this public unmasking in front of the world, felt different. It felt final. The district attorney stood at the center of the courtroom, his voice steady and level as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about accidents. It is not about misunderstandings. It is about choices. John Parker made a series of deliberate, calculated decisions to take the life of his wife, Lisa Parker, a woman who trusted him, loved him, and was the mother of his children." He paused, his sharp gaze flicking toward John, who sat motionless at the defense table. "He planned her death as though it were a military operation, meticulous, organized, and cold. But the thing about plans like these is that the truth always bleeds through, doesn't it? No matter how airtight he thought this crime was, it didn't just crumble. It exploded, and now it is time for John Parker to face the consequences of his actions." Carter felt a swell of bittersweet satisfaction as she heard the jury foreman deliver the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant John Parker guilty of first-degree murder. There was no sound from John, not a gasp, not a flinch. Even as murmurs rippled across the room and the judge banged the gavel for order, John sat stiffly, as though he had turned to stone. The weight of the verdict was crushing, and yet Carter couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a man who regretted what he had done. This was a man who regretted getting caught. As John was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his face gray behind his now hollow stare, Carter and her partner, Detective Raymond Dorsey, exchanged a glance from their seats in the back. "Well, that's that," Dorsey said quietly, breaking the silence between them. Carter shook her head, exhaling slowly. "Not yet." Dorsey tilted his head, waiting for her to elaborate. Later that evening, Carter found herself standing outside the Parker home. It had become a shell of itself, a model suburban house with its pristine lawn and polished shutters, now reduced to whispers and shadows. Neighbors no longer stopped by with baked goods or waved from their porches. The swing set in the backyard sat motionless, the laughter of David and Emily no more than a distant echo. "Hard to believe this is where it all happened," Dorsey muttered as he walked up beside her, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. "You think the kids will ever come back here?" Carter didn't answer immediately. Her chest tightened at the thought of David and Emily, orphans now, caught in the wreckage of their father's crime. Officially they were with relatives in another state, shielded as much as possible from the media storm that had engulfed their family. But Carter knew that no amount of distance or time would ever fully strip away the trauma of what they had endured. "Probably not," she finally said, her voice low. "Too many ghosts. Too much pain." Dorsey nodded solemnly, glancing at the house. "You ever think about how a guy like John Parker gets to this point? I mean, the guy had everything. He could have just walked away." Carter sighed, folding her arms across her chest as though bracing herself against the weight of that question. "Guys like John? It's never about what they don't have. It's about what they think they deserve. He didn't see a way out, so he burned it all to the ground, and now everyone else is left standing in the ashes." In the days following John's conviction, the case continued to haunt the city. The Parker family had been a symbol of everything suburban America aspired to be, warm, happy, picture-perfect. But now, they had become a cautionary tale, a grim reminder that perfection is often a facade. Carter read the headlines that spread like wildfire. It wasn't just Savannah talking about it anymore. The nation had seized on the story, transfixed by the horrifying juxtaposition of John Parker's respectful demeanor and his monstrous actions. John's sentencing hearing was no less emotional than the trial itself. The courtroom was filled with Lisa's closest friends, her siblings and neighbors, who had once turned to the Parkers as the ideal couple. David and Emily, too young to sit through their father's trial, had their testimony read aloud by a guardian. "Mommy loved us so much," David's words echoed through the chamber, trembling but firm. "She always said Daddy was her hero, but heroes don't do bad things like this." Carter felt the words hit her like a gut punch. She cast a glance at John, searching for any trace of humanity, any flicker of guilt, but his face remained as lifeless and unreadable as it had been throughout the entire trial. He was a man who had traded his soul for what he thought was freedom, and in doing so, had lost everything. The judge's voice rang out, bringing the room to a tense silence. "John Parker, for the murder of your wife, Lisa Parker, in the first degree. This court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." As Carter and Dorsey exited the courthouse that day, the midday sun beating down on them, Dorsey let out a long breath. "So that's it," he said flatly. "He'll rot in a cell the rest of his life." "And Lisa won't get hers back," Carter replied quietly. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of every sleepless night spent on the case, every piece of evidence that had brought them to this moment. They walked in silence for a minute, their steps echoing faintly on the pavement. Finally, Dorsey broke it. "I guess we did our job, huh?" "Yeah," Carter said after a moment. "But this isn't just about jobs, Ray. It's about what's left behind. David and Emily, they're the ones who'll live with this forever. They lost both parents in one night. No sentence fixes that." Dorsey nodded grimly, knowing she was right. "You think they'll ever forgive him?" "No," Carter said firmly. "And they shouldn't." The irreparable losses. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the small playground where David and Emily played quietly under the watchful gaze of their Aunt Sarah. Even though they were just a week into their new life living with family out of state, it was painfully clear that nothing was normal anymore. Childhood laughter, once so easy and abundant, had been replaced by quiet murmurs, hesitant conversations, and the kind of solemn looks that should never belong to children so young. Detective Abigail Carter, standing off to the side with Sarah while the children played, couldn't avoid the thought that followed her everywhere since the trial. What happens to them now? They used to say this was the happiest playground in the neighborhood, Sarah said softly, her tone sad as she watched Emily push herself half-heartedly on the swing. Lisa used to bring them here every Saturday. She would pack snacks and a little picnic for them. Carter didn't respond right away. Her eyes were locked on the way David sat silently by the jungle gym, scribbling something on the inside cover of a book. He looked so small, and so much older than his 8 years. He should have been playing tag or climbing on monkey bars. He should have been laughing with his sister the way siblings do. Instead he sat alone with a cloud in his eyes that no amount of sunshine could fix. "They've lost so much," Sarah continued after a pause, running her hands through her hair. "There are nights when David wakes up screaming. He says he sees Daddy standing at his door. And Emily, she doesn't even talk when she's upset. She just clings to that Elmo doll of hers and stares at the wall." Her voice cracked slightly. "I keep asking myself how anything will ever feel normal for them again." Carter reached into her pocket, pulling out the small notebook she kept with her everywhere. It was filled with scribbled thoughts from cases, lines of connections, but lately it had also become a place where she recorded moments like these, the moments that didn't make it into the courtroom or police reports. "They shouldn't have to carry this," Sarah said, shaking her head. "They're just kids. How do I even—" Her voice broke completely now, and she looked away, blinking back tears. "How do I explain to them everything they've already lost?" The ghosts of Lisa's love at night. Carter thought about Lisa Parker too often, about what she might have been thinking in her final moments, or what she would say if she could see her children now. Lisa had been so many things: a teacher, a gardener, a warm and steady light in the lives of everyone who knew her. But above all else, Lisa had been a mother. Every single notebook in the Parker home was filled with little plans for her kids, notes like "buy yellow rain boots for David" and "Emily wants an Elmo birthday cake," research bakeries. It was those little reminders of who Lisa had been, scattered everywhere throughout her life, that somehow hit the hardest. "She must have adored them," Dorsey had commented during the cleanup of the case. They had been standing in Lisa's perfectly arranged, flower-themed garden, each bloom carefully labeled. Carter had picked up one of Lisa's planners that had been tucked away inside the house, still open to the page where she had scrawled in big letters, "Family movie night Friday, popcorn and pajamas." "She did," Carter had answered numbly, staring at the page. "And now she's gone." John had stolen Lisa's life, but in doing so, he had also ripped away the future Lisa had devoted herself to building for their children. This was the hardest truth in the whole case, that Lisa's legacy wasn't just her death, it was the pieces of her children that would never truly heal. The weight of trauma. Weeks went by, but the Parker children's story had captured the nation in a way no one had expected. Reporters wrote sympathetic pieces about the forgotten victims, and neighbors gave tearful interviews about the happy family they thought they knew. But none of it, none of the headlines, none of the stories, could touch the quiet, intimate weight of the children's loss. At school, David avoided his classmates. He hated the way their parents whispered when they picked them up at the end of the day, hated the way the teacher spoke to him in a too soft voice like she was stepping around broken glass. And Emily barely touched her toys anymore, even the ones Lisa had lovingly set aside for her before her death. "Do you think they'll ever trust again?" Sarah asked Carter one evening in a kitchen filled with too many silences. "How do you explain to a child that the person they thought loved them the most turned out to be a monster?" "You don't," Carter replied simply, resting her coffee cup on the scratched dining table in Sarah's modest home. "You can't give them answers they'll never understand. All you can do is let them feel safe again, one day at a time." "But will that be enough?" Sarah asked, almost pleading as if Carter had the key to fixing what was so broken. Carter didn't have an answer, and that truth felt heavier on her than anything else in the case. Justice had been served, John Parker was in a cell, but this, that ache lingering in a child's heart, in the cracks of a family shattered beyond repair, wasn't something the law could fix. A new beginning? One late evening Sarah sat both children down at the kitchen table. A decision had been made to sell the Parker home in Savannah. It would be too painful, too heavy with memories to keep. She explained gently, with Carter sitting quietly in the corner, watching the interaction unfold. "We're going to stay here with Aunt Sarah," Sarah said as brightly as she could, though her smile was paper-thin. "This is a new start for all of us, somewhere safe, somewhere happy." David, older and sharper than his years, immediately frowned. "But Mommy isn't here," he said plainly. Sarah froze for a moment, glancing at Carter for support, but Carter made no move to step in. This was a conversation only family could navigate. "No, sweetheart," Sarah said finally, swallowing hard. "Mommy isn't here, but—" She hesitated before setting her hand gently on his. "Mommy would want you to be somewhere you can grow up safe. Don't you think so?" David stared down at his hands, silent, before whispering, "I just want her back." Sarah pulled both David and Emily into a tight hug, her tears warm against their hair. "I know, baby," she said, her voice breaking. "I know." Moving forward, Carter stood in her precinct office late one night staring at the black and white family photo they'd used during the trial. It showed John, Lisa, David, and Emily standing on the porch of their picturesque Savannah home. Lisa's smile was bright, and her arms were tight around her children. At a glance, it looked perfect, everything America thought it should aspire to be. But Carter knew better now. That photo was a lie. She sighed deeply and shut the folder for the last time. She couldn't undo what had been done. She couldn't give two kids back the life they deserved or give a grieving family the sister they had lost. All she could do was go home, let the case rest, and hope time would soften the scars. The shadows of greed and honor. The story of John Parker was not just a murder case, it became a haunting mirror that reflected the darker depths of human nature. To his friends and neighbors, John had always seemed like the man who had it all. A decorated army sergeant, a respectable family man, a provider who seemed to embody integrity and honor. But beneath that polished surface was a festering greed, an unchecked ambition, and an insatiable hunger for a life of his own making, no matter the cost. Detective Abigail Carter sat at her desk late at night after the trial, her office bathed in the pale glow of a desk lamp. Before her was a cluster of case notes, photos, and interviews organized in neat folders. But Carter wasn't just piecing together evidence anymore. She was trying to understand the psychology of the man she had helped convict. "It wasn't about anger," she murmured aloud, the sound cutting through the quiet of the precinct. "It wasn't even about love." She tapped a pencil against the photo of John Parker in his army uniform, standing proud and composed. This was about greed dressed up as honor. Her partner, Detective Raymond Dorsey, entered with 2 cups of coffee, raising an inquisitive eyebrow. "Talking to yourself again, Abby? Thought we wrapped this case up." Carter leaned back in her chair, accepting the coffee with a faint smile. "The case is closed, Ray, but the man, he's still a riddle, isn't he? Someone like John doesn't just wake up one day and decide to kill his wife. His whole life, everything he did, it all led to this moment." Dorsey sipped his coffee and gestured to the stack of files. "So, what's your theory, Sherlock? What makes a guy like Parker, Mr. Perfect Husband, decide to throw it all away?" "War," Carter said after a moment, her voice thoughtful. "That's where it starts. He spent years in combat, right? Trained to think like a soldier, to prioritize duty, to see life as strategy, obstacles to overcome, missions to complete." "Sure," Dorsey replied, pulling up a chair, "but a lot of guys go into combat and come out okay. They don't off their wives." Carter nodded, but her gaze stayed fixed on the photo. "Not all soldiers come back to easy lives, Ray. For John, that discipline, that need for control, it didn't stop when the war ended. The man we saw in the courtroom, he was still fighting, only this time the enemy wasn't on some distant battlefield, it was his own life." Dorsey tilted his head, intrigued but skeptical. "So you're saying what? He saw Lisa as the enemy?" "No," Carter clarified softly, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Lisa wasn't the enemy. She was the evidence of a life he didn't want anymore. 2 kids, a mortgage, PTA meetings. It didn't fit the image John had of himself. And here's the kicker, he didn't just want out, Ray, he wanted out clean. He wanted control. He wanted honor." Dorsey let out a low whistle. "Honor? The guy rigs his wife's death and lies to his kids, and you call that honor?" Carter shrugged, her lips tightening into a grim line. "It's twisted, but it makes sense in his mind. He had to protect his image. A divorce? That would shatter it. He'd lose the house, half his paycheck, child support, alimony, all things that would make him look weak, dependent. In John's eyes, he wasn't just killing Lisa, he was protecting his reputation. The neighbors, of course, never saw it coming. When John Parker smiled and waved when he manned the grill at block parties or offered to help fix a neighbor's faucet, his mask of suburban perfection never cracked. But behind closed doors, he was unraveling. "He's the kind of guy who rents the tuxedo even when no one's getting married," Carter said, shaking her head. "Everything has to be just right, perfect image, perfect family. But it wasn't for anyone else, it was for him. His whole life was a performance and Lisa was part of it, until she wasn't." "She outgrew the role," Dorsey offered darkly. "Exactly." Carter leaned forward, her hands clasped. "Imagine what that does to someone like John. He spends his whole life thinking he's the hero, the husband, the father, the ex-military man who provides. But his spotless image? It's just a house of cards. And when Lisa starts controlling the finances, when the kids start getting older, when the marriage stops being about, it all starts to crumble." Dorsey gestured toward a file with copies of the love letters John had written to Clara Jones. "And Clara, little Miss No Responsibilities? She was his mirror image, huh? No mortgage, no kids, nothing tying her down." "Exactly," Carter said, her voice firm now. "Clara was his way out. She didn't know him like Lisa did. She didn't see the cracks. To her, John was exciting, strong, bigger than life. She fed the version of himself that he wanted to believe." Dorsey frowned. "So he thinks what, let's kill Lisa, get rid of the problem, and ride off into the sunset with Clara? That's not just greedy, Abby, that's psychotic." "It's both," Carter replied flatly. "But that's the thing about greed, Ray. It doesn't feel like greed to the person who's consumed by it. To John, this whole mess wasn't about taking. He thought he was. He saw himself as the victim, clawing back the life he thought he deserved." "And now?" Dorsey asked after a pause, his voice quieter. "What's he got to show for it?" Carter let out a bitter laugh. "A concrete cell, a case number, and 2 kids who will never look at him the same way again." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the case settling over them like heavy fog. Finally, Dorsey broke it with a wry smile. "You think they'll study this guy someday? Some big-shot psychologist putting his name in a textbook on pathological greed?" Carter shook her head. "Maybe, but they'll never get it right. People like John, they don't fit into tidy textbook categories. They're not just soldiers or fathers or killers, they're contradictions. He wanted control, and it cost him everything. He wanted fame, and now he's infamous. He wanted honor, but he'll go down as a coward." As Carter turned out the desk lamp that night and gathered her coat, she paused to glance back at the photo of John Parker in uniform one last time. The neatly pressed shirt, the proud shoulders, the air of unshakable discipline, it all felt like a cruel joke now. "Greed," she murmured to herself as she locked the door to her office. "It doesn't just take, it destroys, and there's nothing honorable about that." John Parker's story would become bigger than the murder he committed. It would become the cautionary tale of a man who lost everything, his wife, his children, his freedom, and the very honor he'd kill to protect. But no matter how much the world dissected his motives, no one would ever be able to undo the shadow he had cast over the lives of the people who once loved him. Lisa Parker was gone. David and Emily had been robbed of the innocence that defined childhood, and the once perfect Parker family was now reduced to a cautionary tale no one wanted to believe. Greed and honor, they had become the ghosts haunting every step that John Parker would take in the prison of his own making, and outside those walls, the world would go on, never forgetting the shadows he left behind. Deep lessons. The case of John Parker left a scar not just on the Parker family, but on the entire cul-de-sac, the community, and even the country, as it absorbed the shocking details of a seemingly perfect life shattered by hidden darkness. For Detective Abigail Carter, though, it was more than just a case and more than just a crime to solve. It was a bitter reminder of human frailty, the choices, the greed, the lies, and, ultimately, the lessons left behind. Sitting in her precinct office on an abnormally quiet evening, Carter flipped through the last of the case notes. The trial, the sentencing, it was all done. The work itself was over. And yet, the case lingered, like an uncomfortable itch at the back of her mind. Her partner, Raymond Dorsey, walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee, one of which he plunked down in front of her without a word. He sat opposite her, leaning back in his chair like a man who had just run a marathon and was still catching his breath. "All right," Dorsey began with a sigh, gripping his cup, but not drinking from it yet. "Tell me. I know that look, and we've been partners long enough that I can tell you're about to go all philosophical on me." Carter's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, though her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. "You ever wonder, Ray," she began softly, "what this case says about us, about the world we live in, about what happens when people stop thinking about others and only think of themselves?" Dorsey snorted, a low, slightly bitter sound. "You mean when people like John Parker convince themselves they're the goddamn hero of their own story, no matter how many lives they destroy along the way? Yeah, Abby, I think about it. And you know what I think? I think it scares the hell out of me. The danger of masks." Carter leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk as she stared down at an old photo of the Parker family. John in his army uniform, Lisa's bright and genuine smile, David clutching onto his father's leg, and Emily cradled in her mother's arms. It looked like something out of a greeting card. "Every time I look at his photo, I think about the masks people wear," she said, more to herself than to Dorsey. "John wore his so well. The proud father, the war hero, the perfect husband. And the scariest part is, everyone believed him. Even Lisa believed him, right up until the day he decided she wasn't part of his perfect little world anymore." Dorsey raised an eyebrow. "You think it's all about the mask? I mean, yeah, the guy was a fraud through and through, but don't you think people wear masks all the time? Hell, I wear one half the time when my mom calls, pretending everything's fine when it's not. Wearing a mask doesn't make you a killer, Abby." "No," Carter agreed, "but wearing a mask long enough, it makes you forget who you really are." John convinced himself that the idea of him, a perfect family man, a decorated soldier, a pillar of his community, was more important than the actual reality of his choices, and when the mask started to slip, he'd rather destroy everything around him than admit it. "That's where it gets dangerous, Ray." Dorsey stayed quiet for a moment, digesting her words. Finally he said, "I get that, but we've seen selfish murderers before. What makes John Parker different, huh? You think he's special?" Carter shook her head, her brow furrowed. "No, he's not special, that's the lesson. It could have been anyone. John Parker wasn't some caricature of evil. He was a guy who prioritized himself over everyone else. At first it was small stuff, an affair here, a little deceit there, but it snowballed. Greed doesn't hit you all at once, Ray, it creeps in, and when people stop putting others first, they start cutting corners, getting rid of obstacles, sacrificing the people they say they love for themselves." The line between want and need. Dorsey finally sipped his coffee, grimacing slightly at its lukewarm state. "You're saying everyone's got this in them, that everyone's walking this thin line between us and John Parker. Is that it?" Carter glanced up at him, her expression tired but firm. "I think everyone's got the capacity for greed, for selfishness. But you know what? Most people don't cross the line. That's the difference, Ray. Most people, when they want out of a situation, talk it out. They compromise. They reflect. They don't grab electrical wires, rig them into a death trap, and fake a goddamn alibi to protect their fake image." "That's comforting," Dorsey muttered dryly, though his lips twitched upward in something like a smile. "So we're all selfish, but we're not all monsters." "That's just it," Carter said, leaning back in her chair with a sigh. "We don't have to be. The lesson here? It isn't that everyone's secretly a murderer. It's what can happen when you let greed, pride, that need for control, when you let those things take over. It's about knowing where to draw the line, knowing when to step back and realize that your wants don't outweigh the people around you. A mirror to society." Dorsey set down his coffee, rolling the cup between his hands. His voice, when he spoke, was softer now. "You know what this case makes me think about sometimes? How much we missed. Everyone missed it. The neighbors, the friends, hell, even the kids. They didn't see it coming. And it wasn't because they weren't looking, it's because John, he played the part so damn well." Carter nodded. "People see what they want to see, Ray. That's the scary part. You put a man in a crisp shirt, give him a few lines about honor and duty, have him smile at the right moments. That's all it takes for people to believe in the illusion. But after this case, it's hard not to think about how many other perfect lives might just be facades. You never really know what's going on behind someone's front door." "You're not saying we should go suspicious of everyone, right?" Dorsey asked with a nervous chuckle. "No," Carter replied with a faint smirk. "But I am saying we should pay attention, listen more, look closer, hell, maybe even be better neighbors. If this case teaches us anything, it's that sometimes the people who seem like they have it all together are the ones crumbling underneath." For David and Emily. The room fell silent for a moment as both detectives thought about the children, the innocents swept up in the chaos of greed and betrayal. Dorsey's voice was somber when he broke the quiet. "You think Lisa's kids are ever going to be okay?" Carter stared at the photo one last time before closing the file on the case. "I think they'll learn to live with it, but they're going to carry this shadow with them for the rest of their lives. And that might be the hardest lesson of all. The choices we make, even the ones we think are just about us, they ripple into the lives of the people around us. You can't throw a stone in the pond without making waves. Dorsey let out a heavy sigh, pushing his chair back and standing up. Well, if there's one lesson I'm going to take from this, it's to make damn sure my own kids know they're loved. And maybe, God forbid, to pay a little more attention to the families right next door. Carter smiled faintly as she stood, grabbing her coat and following him toward the door. That's not a bad place to start, Ray. Honestly, if even one person learns from all of this, if one family gets closer, if one neighbor knocks on the door just to ask someone how they're doing, then maybe Lisa's death isn't just another tragedy. Maybe that's the one good thing that comes out of all this. Every crime leaves a lesson. The shadows of John Parker's greed lingered far beyond the courtroom, and for every person touched by his crime, the lessons were deeply personal. The neighbors learned to talk a little more. The community learned to look a little closer. And Abigail Carter, as she turned off the light in her office that night, learned that even in the darkest of cases there's something to take forward, a small hope for something better.